Sweat. Thank you all so much for joining us. And welcome to Building Community Climate Resilience, the role of faith communities in addressing natural hazards. My name is Langston Alexander. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Resiliency Fellow for Creation Justice Ministries this summer and a master's student at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. The mission of Creation Justice Ministries is to educate, equip, mobilize Christians and Christian institutions to protect, restore, and rightly share God's creation. Today's program is part of our Climate Resilience Workshop series, in which we're asking, how can our churches be hubs of climate resilience in our communities, helping our neighbors weather the physical and spiritual storms of the climate crisis? We have the previous webinars on our YouTube page, youtube.com/Creation Justice Ministries, and you can subscribe to follow along with any videos we share. We'll be posting this video after we're done here, and so you can rewatch it or send it to other people. Just a brief agenda for today. I'll be giving sort of a brief rundown of the topic and our presenters. Then Dr. Don Baldwin Gibson will be giving a brief prayer, and then our two presenters will be giving their presentations, and we'll end up with a short question and answer session. So without further ado, today we'll be discussing the central role of faith communities in building resilience to climate impacts. I'm sure many of us have been feeling the heat wave that has descended over the US and the world these past few weeks, but this is neither the beginning nor the end of the threats climate change poses to us and our communities and our places of worship. These looming threats, seemingly inevitable, invite fear and despair into our hearts and perhaps push us towards isolation and disconnection as we batten down the hatches and withstand the coming storm. But as the research and experience of our two guests today show, now is the time to reach out and explore dynamic reimaginings of our relationships with each other and our institutions. Through the collaboration and creativity, we can use this time of climactic upheaval to build a better and more just world for all. To discuss this topic, we have two esteemed guests here today, Dr. Don Baldwin Gibson and Dr. Christy Miller Hesed. Dr. Don Baldwin Gibson is the executive pastor of Peletah Ministries in New Bern, North Carolina. She and her husband, Pastor Anthony Gibson, co-founded Peletah in 2011. She serves as the executive director of Peletah Institute for Building Resilient Communities and the superintendent of Peletah Academic Center for Excellence. She completed her Bachelor's of Art in Liberal Studies from Shaw University and her Master's of Arts in English from East Carolina University. She has completed higher education administration doctoral coursework at George Washington University and Nova Southeastern University and earned her doctorate in Christian counseling from Christian Leadership University. Dawn is a member of the North Carolina Faith and Justice Alliance Steering Committee. In 2021, she served as co-chair of the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network's African American Council and is a former chair of the Emotional and Spiritual Task Force and former state board of the North Carolina Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. She authored and/or assisted with grants totaling more than $3 million for community resiliency and hurricane relief and recovery programs. Peletah Ministries has fed more than 300,000 people through partnerships with food banks, food hubs, and the USDA. Dr. Don published her first book entitled A Place Called Home, which chronicles nearly 250 years of her family's history in Eastern North Carolina. She has been the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2017 NAACP Craven County Woman of the Year Award. Dr. Christy Miller Hesed is an environmental anthropologist and conservation biologist whose work focuses on climate change adaptation and environmental justice. She is a postdoctoral research associate at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, where she co-leads a project identifying the science needed to support climate adaptation in the North Central grasslands. She previously worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Maryland and was the director of Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience, an applied research project that worked with rural coastal communities to address climate change on the Chesapeake Bay. Her doctoral research focused on rural African American communities on Maryland's eastern shore in order to understand environmental justice, vulnerability, adaptation, and resilience to sea level rise. A member of the Mennonite Church, Christy has also worked to increase concern for climate justice within her own congregation and denomination by presenting at a pastor's retreat and sharing through webinars and blog posts. Dr. Hesed is a former EPA Star Fellow and is currently living in Heston, Kansas. Before I hand it over to the speakers, just a few housekeeping things to note. If you haven't yet, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, pronouns, where you're calling in from, and congregational denominational affiliation if you have not. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. Please be thinking of questions that you'd like answered by the presenters and enter them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. If you enter the questions into the group chat, they may get buried by other messages and lost. So if you can remember, please put them in the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your screen. This workshop is being recorded and will be sent out to all participants via email next week. So I will let Dr. Dawn Baldwin Gibson start us off with a short prayer here and then go into her presentation. Dr. Dawn, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Langston, and blessings to you all. If you would, please join me in a short word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for this opportunity to join together. We ask you to give comfort to those today and the days that are coming that are struggling with excessive heat and those dealing with extreme weather patterns. Please let us not only have good prayers for them, but also be willing to act as the servants that you have called us to be. Make us good stewards of this earth as you have commanded us, and let it start with us tonight. We pray in your holy name. Amen. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. If you watch on the replay or if you are in different time zones, it is really an honor to be here. Thank you, Langston. Thank you, Avery, for this wonderful opportunity to talk with you about this very important conversation. And I really want it to be a conversation. I was looking at the introductions, and there are so many people that bring so much wisdom. I always say, one of my mentors taught me, the wisdom is in the room. And so the wisdom is in this collective room tonight. And so I just want to share briefly about the work that we have been doing at Peletah Ministries, and hopefully you can let me know in the chat. Hopefully you can see my screen and this presentation as we start it. And so I want to talk about this work that we call building community, and specifically around climate resiliency and what we've been doing in Peletah Ministries. Peletah is located in rural Eastern North Carolina, and so it is without saying that it would be that we would end up being a part of this conversation on climate, being in a coastal community here in Eastern North Carolina. Peletah Ministries, just as a little bit of background, we started July the 17th, 2011. I cannot believe, but it has been 11 years already. And literally 6 weeks after we started, Eastern North Carolina was hit by Hurricane Irene. And so immediately we started doing outreach work. And I remember one of the major issues was that more than 40,000 vehicles had been either flooded or destroyed, and people weren't able in rural communities to get to where food was. So we started driving food to communities. But we realized that there was a lot of work that we were going to have to get done. And so what we did was we said, well, we're going to work on making sure that people get their needs met. And how do we do that? And so we knew that we had to have a conversation beyond relief, but really about recovery and ultimately about resiliency. And so we started doing this work of recovery. I actually chaired the long-term coalition in recovery for our county here in Pamlico County. And what we realized was we had so many people that were what FEMA calls non-compliant. Those folks that had been impacted by a storm and they got assistance through FEMA, but because they were unable to keep their flood insurance, they weren't able to get assistance again from FEMA, and it made them what they call non-compliant. Well, we had so many in our community that we really had to think about how do we get people back in their homes. And so we did a partnership with a national organization called 8 Days of Hope. And they brought, at that time, it was the largest volunteer initiative in the state of North Carolina, with more than 2,000 volunteers from around the world. And they provided free labor to more than 80 homeowners, and were able to get them back into their homes safely. And so what we realized was that during what we call blue sky planning, that we needed to understand that these storms were going to continue to come. Unfortunately, they were going to become stronger, but we had to build resiliency within our communities to be able to meet these challenges. And one of the things we did, which was really kind of simple, after one of the storms in 2016, Hurricane Matthew, we decided to put together what we call the Eastern North Carolina Disaster Resources Facebook page. It is a Facebook page, but we have more than 6,000 folks that are on and offline, and we provided resources and information on how to build that resiliency. And so what we learned from the climate disaster is something that I always say, is that whatever is in the community at the time of the disaster, it is only amplified by the disaster. And so we put together what we called our own FEMA response that says we are going to build infrastructure of resiliency around these key areas. So access to food, education, economics, environment, energy, engagement, and employment, and mental health resources, access to affordable health care, access to affordable housing. We realized that these were the areas that were being so greatly impacted, and the communities that were being hardest hit were those that had the greatest need. And so in blue sky planning, how then do we, as anchor institutions, the churches, houses of worship, how do we do this work? And this is really how we began to do it. We said, instead of our determining what was best for the community, we said we want to go into the community, listen, hear, and then develop responses. And so each one of these pictures that you see here are different counties. It's Pamlico, Craven, and Jones here. The top picture is in Pamlico County, our home county. It's at a local church's annex. And we just called people together to hear what they were going through after the hurricane that had recently impacted. The picture on the bottom left is at a church in Craven County. And that was after a hurricane. And these are faith leaders that were coming together, trying to determine how do we best serve our communities. And then the next one was in Jones County, a very rural county. It was all word of mouth. We had more than 200 people show up within a 72-hour time frame for this pop-up event. And what we did was we created what we call the Shell Community Model. And this was something that we developed to really help the, not just resiliency, but the emotional well-being and the spiritual stability of our communities, to keep them stabilized. And so this is really just a framework that really helps to determine how do we work in community to build strong community infrastructure so that people can feel their own sense of resiliency. Yes, we want the communities to be safe and whole, but we want the individuals to feel that as well. And so this is what we have been doing over these last few years. And so the first thing that we look at is safety. And when we think about safety, it is really about being able to assess and enhance the immediate and ongoing emotional safety and comfort. Because what we realize is that even if it's not a storm, a hurricane, as we thought about natural disasters, I mean, we had a really bad rain event about 2 weeks ago that flooded homes in our communities. And so what we've recognized is that we may not always see that storm coming, but we have to be prepared. And we have to have this sense of this emotional safety. And so part of that is meeting needs. And so the way we look at building safety in our communities is really about meeting the needs that people have. So you can see here, whether it is through food and making sure that people have access to that food, like we talked about earlier, that FEMA approach in community work, food access. The picture at the bottom left outside the church was literally the day after landfall of Hurricane Florence, and lights were out throughout the community. People just didn't have those resources that they needed. And so here, this was purely word of mouth. People came. Safety may look like bringing children together and letting them talk about, as you see in the top right. And so all of these are really important spaces of making sure that we are building this resiliency. As the church, as the anchor institutions, hope, what does that mean? So you see here, once again, whatever it is that we're doing in the community, and here's the thing, it's not just us. We have sought to make sure that we across the board. So it is not just our church doing this work. We have a network of more than 400 churches that we have developed relationships with over the past decade that we are able to get information to. And they have their own processes. They have their medically fragile list of people who, if a storm hits or there's a crisis in the community, making sure we know where people are located and where they're going to be if a storm comes. They're going to be at Jesse's house in Charlotte, that the communities know where their community members are. But really about building hope is about seeing needs met. And so we do that in so many different ways through the mental health work that we are doing, as well as the food, as well as employment connections, and making sure through education that we're doing all of these different processes, because why? It builds us better to be able to respond. And so we find that the churches, and each one of these you'll see is a church. Bottom left is a church, the middle with the kids with the American Red Cross, that's at a church. Them doing COVID-19 work, that was at a church. And then just making sure that we are continuing to understand the importance of advocacy and letting community members know that you're not forgotten, that all communities will be served. And then lastly is lasting linkages. It is building resiliency through community resourcing and making sure that churches are aware of what's available. And so one of the things that when I talk about the wisdom is in the room, we kept hearing, even though Florence was 4.5 years ago, Matthew 6.5 years ago, people are still trying to rebound from those storms. And so what we realized was that we needed to pull resources together. And so we created what is called the Peletah ENC, Eastern North Carolina Regional Church and Community Resiliency Collaborative. And we reached out to those same churches and we said, listen, here's all of what you are saying that you need. We had a health equity room. We had the director of the Department of Homeland Security Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, Office of the FEMA Administrator, Director Marcus Coleman from the White House to come in. We had state, local, we had our U.S. Senator staff, Senator Tillis staff come in. It was across the board. It wasn't that partisanship was out the door, because it was really about the community and meeting these needs. Now, it was on a Monday. So we thought, okay, we'll see. We'll probably have about 200 folks there. We had food boxes from local farmers. We did all of this, and we actually had more than 650 people show up on that Monday. And what we recognized was that the need is there. People know what they need. And when they are given the opportunity to access those resources, that they are there. And so we told our faith leaders, specifically our pastors and leaders of local houses of worship, that we would take 90 days, come back and bring funders, resource providers to the room. And so we did that, and we had grant funders from throughout the southern region to come and talk about how they could connect to funding. And we actually had organizations that gave many grants. And so we were able to build this infrastructure around making sure that communities have what they need. And so whether it is health equity, education, food systems, mental health, it is all encompassing to this very important work of building climate resiliency. And so with that, we want to say, we want to connect with you. So please, we'll put our information to contact us, but we really want to be a resource, but we also want to be a sponge, and we want to be able to learn the work that is happening throughout our nation and beyond. Thank you so very much. And I think Langston has a video to share with you as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawn. And yeah, we have a quick video here to share on the Resiliency Collaborative.
This event is the Eastern North Carolina Regional Church and Community Resiliency Collaborative, and we thought that the best place to have this event was at the New Bern Riverfront Convention Center, because this place, as beautiful as it is really all about resiliency. You think about how Hurricane Florence had impacted this space, and you think about, as the mayor was saying this morning, the alligator tracks through here and all of the water, and then you see this absolutely magnificent facility that now has this beautiful space called The View, the riverfront veranda. All of it is just absolutely perfect for a day to bring in people who are survivors of Hurricane Florence to say, enjoy this beautiful space, take a moment, walk outside, look at the water, feel the breeze, and have a wonderful day. We couldn't have had a better experience.
It's going great. Beautiful view behind me. A lot of great people here, helping a lot of people, and it's going great.
I think it's very open and allows for space for people to move around very well. I like that we can have different rooms for different sectors, as well as have the meeting in a large space.
This venue here, since it's been remodeled, is fantastic. A great opportunity here to showcase what we do in the community here. And the lighting in here, isn't it incredible? I'm loving it here.
Awesome. And with that, we will move on to a presentation by Dr. Christy Miller Hesed. Christy, take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Langston. Let me share my screen here. All right. Let me know if you're unable to see that. Otherwise, I'll assume that you can. Dawn, I want to thank you very much for that presentation. I think a lot of what you shared resonates with the research project I'll be talking about, in particular, your points on the importance of lasting linkages and recognizing that the wisdom is in the room. So really appreciated that. Thanks to Langston and to Avery for organizing this and inviting me to speak with you all today. As Langston said, I'm currently working at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'll share a little bit about the work of that center at the end of my presentation. But today I want to focus on work that I did with churches from 2017 to 2019 on the issue of sea level rise while at the University of Maryland. This project was entitled Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience and was funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate Program Office. While this project included an interdisciplinary team from the University of Maryland, It was led by myself and 2 other environmental anthropologists. So in case some of you are unfamiliar with environmental anthropology, this is a field of research that focuses on complex social environmental problems. As a discipline, we examine how culture and the environment shape each other in complex and dynamic ways. And we use a bunch of different methods to conduct our research, including interviews and surveys, workshops, and also something called participant observation, which is where we really attentively and intentionally immerse ourselves in local activities to better understand the local culture by experiencing it firsthand. The Engaging Faith Communities for Coastal Resilience project grew out of research that a group of environmental anthropologists at the University of Maryland had been doing in rural areas on the Chesapeake Bay for many years. And so in my own previous research, I'd been working with rural African American communities, primarily through local churches, to understand how the communities had been coping with flooding for generations and how that flooding was likely to impact them in the future. I used an environmental justice lens for this research. Environmental justice is the fair distribution of both benefits and harms that are experienced from the environment. And so when we talk about fair distribution of benefits and harms, that's what's known as distributive justice. However, another type of justice called procedural justice is often really important for distributive justice to be realized. Procedural justice has to do with the ability of everyone to be able to fairly participate in making the decisions about how our limited resources are used and distributed. So from my work with rural African American church communities, I saw that historic and cultural legacies of racial discrimination meant that there often was not procedural justice, but rather there was a disconnect between, on the one hand, the rural African American communities that are facing increased flooding from sea level rise, and then on the other hand, the government agencies that have the flood adaptation resources to distribute. So I had identified this procedural justice problem, but I wasn't sure how it might best be addressed. Meanwhile, further south on the Chesapeake Bay, colleagues of mine were using an approach called collaborative learning to bring together rural watermen communities, scientists, and county and state government officials to try to understand how climate change impacts were affecting the local community. As a result of all this previous research in the region, colleagues and I found a number of things. First, rural lands are particularly vulnerable to climate change. While these areas have less infrastructure than urban areas, nevertheless face substantial risks to local ecosystems, to livelihoods, and to community well-being. And then the second thing we saw was that rural areas can be difficult to engage in climate adaptation discussions. The absence of municipal governments in these rural areas particularly limits the channels of communication and resource distribution. So the problem as we saw it was how to ensure that rural areas aren't overlooked by those who are making decisions about climate adaptation strategies. And across all of our projects, procedural justice by and county and state government climate change.
Hey everyone, it seems like we're having some technical difficulties on Christy's end here, so just give us just a minute. We'll see if we can get her back on. Thank you.
Langston, is it okay if I answer one of the questions that was asked?
Absolutely, that would be
Okay.
great. Appreciate it,
Okay.
Dr. Don.
Certainly. So I just saw a question from Lucy that asked about inequities of access to resources after a disaster, which is an absolutely great question, because it is something that is a struggle in the work that we do. And so it is, there is, and Dr. Christy was just talking about it, with the lack of municipalities in some of these very rural communities, then when resources are being distributed, people may not even be aware of them. And so it's in this blue sky planning piece is that there are three things that we try to do. One is to leverage resources. So when there are resources like here in North Carolina, land loss prevention, that really helps communities grapple with issues around air property that always comes up during disasters and trying to get work on homes done. When you have free resources that are available, what we talk about first is how do we leverage existing resources. So it's looking at what is available in the community. It's that mapping of the community and understanding where we can leverage relationships in an equitable way. I think the other piece really has a lot to do with funding and resources. And so one of those big things has been ARPA, the American Rescue Plan funds, right? And so lots of communities have been trying to find out about that information. And so it's being equitable. How do we get the resources to the people that have the greatest need? Dr. Christy?
Thanks, Dawn. I apologize again for my technical issues here. It hasn't been an issue all week. So I'm praying for Zoom mercies here. And as I was starting to say, yes, good idea, Avery. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and take my video off and see if that helps. Hopefully you all can still hear me. And what I'll plan to do is record this and share it with Langston and Avery in case pieces of that were missed, but I'll go ahead and just continue on for now. And again, thank you all for your patience. So anyway, the reason we wanted to explore the potential role that churches could play in helping to build these, as Dawn phrased it, lasting linkages. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Appreciate that heads up. Was because we saw that churches are widely distributed in rural coastal areas. They're attended by a diverse network of residents. And we know that church congregations and leadership are really intimately familiar with community needs and local environmental changes. I think Dawn's presentation showed that really well also. And then churches are highly trusted social entities. And so we wrote up this idea as a research proposal, and the project was funded. And then to test this hypothesis, we brought together a bunch of different stakeholder groups. Again, we did this study on Maryland's Lower Eastern Shore. So for those of you not familiar, this is the Chesapeake Bay here. And then this area is Maryland's Lower Eastern Shore. And we worked in these three counties and then specifically in these low-lying areas. So we included members of 12 rural churches, state and county government staff. We also included members of environmental, non-governmental organizations. And then we considered ourselves, as well as the rest of the research team, to be stakeholders also. So before we gathered people together for in-person engagement, we spent a lot of time gathering information to understand the diversity of knowledge and perspectives that existed among our different stakeholder groups. So we did this by conducting interviews, and then we brought together 40 individuals from across the 12 rural churches and from across the different government agencies to attend a 6-hour workshop. And we did different activities, but a key one was a collaborative mapping activity where participants worked by county groups to identify areas of concern in relation to flooding. We followed up then with 2 to 3 community meetings in each county, And these meetings focused on those particular coastal environmental challenges that were identified by county groups at the first workshop. And then we had a final workshop at the end of the project to share our key findings and discuss possible next steps. Throughout all of these community meetings and workshops, we used this collaborative learning approach. So just to say a little bit more about what I mean by collaborative learning, this is an approach where everyone gets a chance to teach and to learn from each other. Perhaps the traditional way things happen is that a scientist or government staff person might come into a community to present information, maybe answer some questions, and then go home. So this is what we call a top-down approach. But with collaborative learning, we're turning that model onto its side so that instead of top-down, you have more of a round table. So we're treating all participants as having a form of expert knowledge that's really important to share, whether it's scientific knowledge or local experiential knowledge. And so to facilitate collaborative learning, we were really intentional about creating a space in which everyone would feel comfortable for participating. So for example, we often started workshops, much as we started this webinar, with a prayer from a pastor. And that helped the church members to feel more comfortable. And it also signaled to government employees that this was going to be a different kind of meeting than what they might be used to. And then we were also explicit at the outset about the various perspectives in the room. So we emphasized, for example, that though we didn't all agree on the causes of climate change, we did all agree that we could see there were changes happening and that these needed to be addressed. So after these collaborative workshops, we analyzed our data to identify the capacities of the churches as well as their limitations. And I'm going to share just a few of these that emerged from our project. And I'm sure all of you will have thoughts and insights on this as well. And if you want to share those in the chat, I'd be really interested to see what you think. But some of the things that emerged from this study was that one of the key strengths of churches is the ability to provide spiritual and emotional support and guidance in times of hardship. And this is going to be especially important as people are facing loss of property and other impacts from erosion, flooding, and storms. But we also learned that these churches have, in these rural areas, have little to no experience in addressing environmental challenges from within the church. Though the churches in our project share a message of responsible stewardship of God's creation, working to address local environmental challenges was just not a traditional part of church activities. Another key strength of churches is that members are highly motivated to take action to support their communities. And again, I'm thinking of Don's great presentation with lots of examples of this. In our study, many of the church members are involved in community programs and activities, such as bringing meals to seniors who are housebound, or helping to pay a family's utility bill. Church members care really deeply for their church and for the broader community, and so are likely to put support for things where they see clear community benefits. Unfortunately, the changing demographics of church membership in rural areas is starting to limit this tradition of community service. So church membership in rural areas is both declining and aging as younger families move to more urban areas. And this reduces the ability of congregations to do the community work that they've done in the past. And then perhaps the most important ability churches had in helping to address rural environmental challenges is that they're extremely well familiar with rural concerns and local level changes. So there's a huge opportunity for government and others who are interested in helping to build climate resilience to better understand what the rural concerns are by inviting church members to share those concerns and needs. A limitation to this, though, is that we found rural congregations can be fairly isolated. Church members may not have reliable internet access in some rural places. Another challenge we found is that when church leadership maybe transitions, government officials might not know how to find that new contact information. So those little things can make a real difference. And we also found that some of the rural churches were isolated from each other. And while many are facing similar challenges, there hasn't been a lot of effort to coordinate among those churches that were in our study. So if churches were to come together, they could potentially have a much bigger voice in raising their concerns to elected officials. So those are some of the capacities and limitations we identified for the churches in terms of serving in this role of helping to build those, as Don put it, those lasting linkages between the community members and between the government and non-governmental staff of these agencies and organizations. We also looked at some of the benefits and challenges of a collaborative learning approach itself. And I'm going to go through these really quickly because I know with the technical difficulties, we lost some time. But there were 6 main benefits of collaboration. We saw that it improved knowledge, government better understood what those rural concerns were, and locals better understood both the resources the agencies might have available, but also some of the limitations. Crucial in this project, we saw that using that collaborative learning approach built trust and rapport. And without those, I don't think you can have those lasting linkages. By engaging with churches through this collaborative learning process, it was an opportunity for county, state, and NGO groups to be able to engage with folks that they don't often get to. And then we saw it helped to ease some of those difficult conversations. It's difficult to talk about climate change and sea level rise. And those can be politically fraught conversations, but by using collaborative learning, they didn't become easy, but they became possible. Also, collaborative learning, it doesn't necessarily yield tangible outcomes right away, but we did see that there's opportunities for some creative, tangible solutions to be found. And then it also, by creating this comfortable space for church members to learn and share their concerns, it empowers communities that are at risk of coastal impacts to be able to engage in and shape adaptation planning discussions to meet local needs. So the benefits, I think, were significant. I do want to be transparent that there are also challenges to this. Building trust between groups that have not worked together before takes an awful lot of time and effort, and there's just no way around that. And then there's challenges in terms of navigating social hierarchies. There's government jargon. We also found that faith-based language was unfamiliar to some government officials, and so fear of causing offense was a barrier to effective communication at some times. Of course, finding common goals is always a challenge when you're working with different stakeholder groups. Climate change is just new and difficult, and I'll leave that one there. And then institutional barriers, the challenge that there is not an institutional structure in place to really carry on these collaborations, which do take so much time and energy, but which are so important for building these social networks and building coastal resilience. So this is a figure from one of our papers. You don't have to worry about all the fine print, but just to show that through this collaborative learning process, we found that, in fact, yes, rural churches can play an important role in facilitating meaningful engagement between government decision makers and rural church communities, and that this can result in increased rural resilience to climate change. So the big takeaway for me is that churches and church leadership can play a really important role in helping to connect parishioners and the surrounding community with information and other resources that government agencies have to help prepare for, to help respond to the impacts of climate change. And I think this would hold true whether we're talking about flooding and sea level rise or other climate-related hazards. So to wrap up my talk, just really quickly, I'm gonna highlight the center that I'm working for, as well as a couple of other climate change centers that have resources that might be of interest to your parishioners and communities. So I'm currently working for the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. It serves these 7 states here in Teal. And you can see there's 9 regional centers, and these are all collaborations between the US Geological Survey and regional academic institutions. And the mission of these centers is to provide climate science to support federal, state, and tribal natural resource managers. But even if you're not a resource manager, you'll find climate information, webinars, and more at your regional CASC's website. So I believe Avery has that link that's at the bottom of the slide and can put that in the chat for you all. A couple of other regional climate offices I want to highlight. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has regional offices that provide agriculture-related climate information. These are called USDA Climate Hubs. And then the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has what's called RISAs. That stands for Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments. And these focus on, I believe, water-related climate impacts. And again, I shared that link at the bottom of the slide with Avery, and so hopefully both of those can be put in the chat. I'll wrap up now. Again, thank you so much for bearing with my technical difficulties, and just want to say a quick thanks to NOAA for funding the research I presented, as well as to the research participants and my colleagues who co-led the project, Drs. Michael Pauliso and Elizabeth Vandola.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hesed, and thank you both. It was so powerful and inspiring to hear about the work that you both are doing. So we're going to move into our about 10 minutes of questions and answers right now. So to start us off, after hearing from Dr. Hesed, this is going to be directed towards Dr. Dawn. Have you been able to interact and integrate your work into local, state, federal government? Have you found the ability to collaborate there and to create some of those overlaps that Dr. Hesed was talking about in her research?
I think that we have been able to, but it is not a quick fix. It is something that it's around building relationships of understanding. She talked about language and making sure that we find those common goals. And so it has not been a quick work, but it has happened. We've seen changes, for example, in the question that was asked earlier about equity. There have been some definitive things that have been done that address this issue around equity in distribution of resources, and what does it mean to be resilient, and what does it mean to have equitable resiliency. And so and that means engaging all of our elected officials and helping them understand, if they don't, that all people make up the community. And so we work really hard at doing that and building consensus and building that common ground. And once we've been able to do that, we have seen those changes made. We probably would like to see them a whole lot faster, but they are happening, and we are going to continue, because really we can make the changes, but if the funding, the resources, the equitable distribution doesn't happen, then we still have a long ways to go. And so it is a process. And so sometimes we go to the table, and sometimes we have to create our own table.
Yeah, and I feel like that's shown really in your presentation and the work you've done. Have you all been able to really create some of these structures that maybe then bring other people in and draw them in? And Dr. Hesed, for you and your current work, which it seems more of a scientific capacity in some ways, have you been able to draw some of your past experiences of these collaborative learning structures into your newer role, where you're working with scientific and academic organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. The project that I've been focused on in my new position at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center is looking at the grassland ecosystems and trying to identify for resource managers what are their information needs so that they can manage these grassland systems within the stresses of climate change, and then to look at, well, in the existing science, what do we know, and where do we need to put more research? And by doing this synthesis project, what we've really found is where we need a lot more work is in that nexus between the social and the environmental, to understand all those complex linkages. And so while I haven't done a lot of that work at the center so far, going forward, it looks like there will be opportunities to do that.
Awesome. So maybe time for one or two more. The second question of mine is, in both of your presentations, we brought up sort of the emotional and social resilience aspect of climate change and disaster. It's easier, it seems, to measure the physical responses, the number of people we feed, right? Houses protected, all those things are very important, but the social and emotional support is just as important, but can be harder to quantify. How can faith communities, in your work and your experiences, be supported in this crucial work of supporting communities emotionally and socially through these disasters? And Dr. Baldwin, I'll kick it to you first to sort of dive into ways that we can help support these communities doing this work.
So I think there are a couple of things really quickly about that, is that, yeah, you're right. So we can see when people are back in their homes, and we can see when rebuilding is happening. But what about the actual emotional and spiritual care of an individual? I think there are a couple of things there. When we think about COVID-19 and what the impact of the last 2.5 years have had on our lives, there's just so much that has changed. Church attendance changed, how people worship changed, where people worship changed, how people grieved, how they lost people. We had a scholar at our school that was killed shortly after we closed down for the first shutdown. And I can remember I was asked to preach that eulogy. I preached it outside on a church carport. There's nothing normal about those processes. And what happened was we kept going. And so how then do we step back? And so part of it, I think we have to reduce and eliminate the stigma around mental health care in our communities, and especially in our faith communities. We have a trauma-informed worship experience that we created several years ago. And so, when people think of a HIPAA, we have our own spiritual HIPAA. People say, well, why are y'all not broadcasting online? It's because we don't want the altar to be shared, because those are very sacred moments. And so it's just making the changes as needed. We have an entire clinician staff on our church staff. And so, if we need to make referrals, we have a project that we're working right now with the North Carolina DHHS that helps people who are uninsured or underinsured to get mental health care. We have to lead by example. And so I think the church has a wonderful opportunity in this time, is to help people say, it's okay if you're not okay. These are not okay times that we're living in, but what we can do is be the beacon of light that we've been called to be.
Great. And Dr. Hesed, I guess in your work, especially on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, did you see this come up in these conversations, these kind of more hidden benefits of the work that faith communities do?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that was, I think, really striking to me in pulling together for engagement, pastors, parishioners, and these government staff folks. For those who were working in a government agency, their daily work on climate adaptation might involve looking at numbers, looking at maps. And so it was really amazing to watch them meet the people who were on the front lines of experiencing this flooding and the storms, and kind of that aha moment of, this is an emotional event. These are people's homes, these are people's communities. And I was, I guess, touched and impressed by one of the policymakers just discussing what possible next steps might look like. And she suggested, next time there's some kind of event that people need to come to our office to get assistance, some sort of assistance, or fill out the forms, or the kind of technical stuff that her particular office helped with. She said, would it be possible to have a table where a sort of technical helper is sitting beside a pastor, so that we can care for the whole person, address the forms they need to fill out, but also have someone they can talk to support them emotionally and spiritually. And so that recognition of the important role that churches play in caring for individuals' spiritual and emotional resilience, I think was really powerful, and was something that came directly from that long, sometimes difficult process of getting these groups together in collaborative learning.
Thank you so much. We're just about at time here. I'm sorry we did not get to all the questions that were put in from the audience, but we will try to get some of those answered and maybe send those out in our post-workshop email. Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Dr. Christy Miller Hesed and Dr. Don Baldwin Gibson. Again, so inspiring to hear the work that you're doing. Just to close here, a few announcements from us. We will be having a Faith, Communities, and Climate Resilience Summit on Thursday, August 18th from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. It's organized by Creation Justice Ministries and other Southeastern faith organizations, and we'll be carrying on a lot of these conversations we're having here. So we'll be touching on kind of racial justice, climate change, and disaster work. We'll be touching on community-based climate resilience, how communities in themselves can be more resilient to climate change, as well as a host of workshops that people can attend and learn from each other at. So I think the links were just posted in the chat, but it's bit.ly/Resilience Summit 2022. And with that, we're a minute over time, so I will close it out. Thank you all so much for attending, and keep your eye out for more of these. And please join us at our Resilience Summit coming up on August 18th. Thank you all so much, and have a nice night.